I watched in horror as Sheriff Corinne stepped out of her patrol car with a satisfied smirk on her face. Behind her, a demolition crew was finishing the destruction of my grandfather's bridge, the only way to reach my home, the only connection I had to the outside world. 70 years of family history reduced to splinters floating down the creek. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the eviction papers she held in her hand, papers I had never seen before, papers I had never signed. For 3 years, I lived the life most people only dream about. My small house sat on 40 acres of rolling hills and dense woods, 15 miles outside of town. The only way to reach my property was across an old wooden bridge my grandfather built in 1952. He constructed it with his own hands, using oak beams and steel cables that had lasted through decades of floods and storms. Every morning I would walk across that bridge with my coffee and watch the sun rise over the valley. The sound of water flowing beneath the wooden planks had become my daily meditation. I ran a small online business from my home office, selling handmade crafts to customers across the country. The isolation was not loneliness, it was freedom. My grandfather had chosen this spot specifically because he wanted to be left alone. After serving in World War II, he craved peace and quiet. He taught me that sometimes the best way to live is to stay out of everyone else's business. For most of my adult life, I followed that advice. The bridge was more than just transportation. It represented everything my family valued: independence, self-reliance, the right to live on your own terms without interference from people who did not understand your choices. But over the past year, things had started changing in our county. Sheriff Corinne Martinez had been elected on a platform of law and order. She promised to crack down on what she called rural lawlessness and property code violations. Most people in town supported her because they thought she was talking about drug dealers and abandoned buildings. I should have paid more attention to her campaign speeches. I should have realized that people like her do not distinguish between actual criminals and folks who just want to be left alone. To Sheriff Corinne, anyone who lived outside the system was automatically suspicious. The first warning sign came when my neighbor called to tell me that Corinne had been asking questions about my property. She wanted to know how often I came and went. She asked about my business. She even inquired about the bridge, claiming she was concerned about public safety hazards. My neighbor laughed it off at the time. "She is just being thorough," he said, "new sheriff trying to learn the area." But I felt a cold chill in my stomach. I had dealt with people like Corinne before, people who used their authority to control others, people who could not stand the idea that someone might be living happily without their permission. The first time Sheriff Corinne appeared at my bridge, I was working in my garden behind the house. I heard a car door slam and looked up to see her walking across the wooden planks with a clipboard in her hand. She wore mirrored sunglasses and had her hand resting on her service weapon, even though I posed no threat to anyone. I walked over to meet her, wiping dirt from my hands on my jeans. She did not bother with pleasantries. "Are you the property owner here?" she asked. "Yes, I am. Is there a problem?" She looked around my property with obvious disapproval. "This bridge appears to violate several county safety codes. I need to conduct an immediate inspection." I felt my heart rate increase, but I kept my voice calm. "This bridge has been here for over 70 years. It was built by my grandfather on my own property. What codes are you referring to?" Corinne pulled out a folder and waved it at me without letting me see the contents. "Safety regulations require all private bridges to meet current engineering standards. This structure appears to be non-compliant." "May I see the specific regulations you are citing?" Her jaw tightened. Are you questioning my authority? I am asking to see the legal basis for your inspection. This is private property, and I have rights. That was when her mask slipped for the first time. The professional demeanor disappeared, and I saw the real Corinne underneath. Her face flushed red, and she stepped closer to me in an obvious attempt at intimidation. "Let me make something clear," she said. "I am the sheriff of this county. When I tell you there is a safety violation, there is a safety violation. You can cooperate or you can deal with the consequences." I stood my ground. "I would be happy to cooperate once you show me the proper documentation and legal authority." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly not used to being challenged. Most people probably just gave in when she showed up with her badge and aggressive attitude. "Fine," she said finally. "You want to play games, we can play games. But I promise you this, that bridge is going to be brought into compliance one way or another." She turned and walked back to her patrol car without another word. As she drove away, I noticed she spent several minutes sitting at the end of my driveway, making notes in her clipboard. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the look in her eyes when I questioned her authority. It was not just anger, it was something deeper, something personal. I spent hours researching county bridge regulations online. As far as I could tell, private bridges on private property were not subject to the code she had mentioned. Even if they were, there were specific procedures for inspections and violations. None of those procedures involved showing up unannounced and making vague threats. By morning, I realized Sheriff Corinne was not interested in safety codes or legal compliance. She was interested in power, and for some reason, my peaceful existence on my own property had become a challenge to that power. 2 weeks later, I drove into town to pick up supplies and mail. The trip took most of the morning because I had to make several stops. I was looking forward to getting home and spending the afternoon working on a new craft project. As I approached my property, I heard the sound of heavy machinery. My stomach dropped. There was no construction scheduled in my area, no utility work, no legitimate reason for equipment to be operating near my home. I turned the corner and saw a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A large excavator was parked next to my grandfather's bridge. Half of the structure had already been destroyed. Pieces of oak beam and steel cable were scattered in the creek below. Sheriff Corinne stood beside her patrol car with her arms crossed, watching the demolition with obvious satisfaction. 2 deputies flanked her, both looking uncomfortable with the situation. I slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my truck. "Stop! What are you doing?" The excavator operator looked confused and shut off his engine. Corinne walked over to me with that same smirk I had seen during our first encounter. "Emergency safety situation," she said. "This bridge was declared an immediate hazard to public welfare." "Public welfare? This is my private property. Where is your warrant?" She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Emergency demolition order, signed by the county safety inspector this morning." I grabbed the paper and quickly scanned it. The document was filled with official-sounding language, but something felt wrong. The inspector's signature looked different from documents I had seen before. The formatting was inconsistent. Most importantly, there was no specific description of the alleged safety hazard. "This is fake," I said. Corinne's eyes flashed with anger. "Are you accusing me of falsifying official documents?" "I am saying this document does not look legitimate, and you have no right to destroy my property without proper legal procedures." "I have every right to protect public safety," she snapped. "This bridge was an accident waiting to happen." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Then explain to me exactly what safety hazard justified destroying a bridge that has stood safely for 70 years. Put that phone away, or I will arrest you for interfering with official business. I am standing on my own property, documenting the destruction of my own bridge. That is not interference. She stepped closer, her hand moving toward her handcuffs. You are obstructing a lawful demolition order. What law gives you the right to destroy private property without a court order or proper notice? The two deputies exchanged worried glances. Even they seemed to realize this situation was spiraling out of control. But Corinne was committed now. She had gone too far to back down. Restart that excavator, she ordered. Ma'am, one of the deputies said quietly, maybe we should. I said restart the excavator. The operator looked between us uncertainly, then fired up his machine. I watched helplessly as the rest of my grandfather's bridge was reduced to debris. Each falling beam felt like a physical blow to my chest. When it was over, I stood at the edge of my property with no way to reach my house. My truck was parked on the county road, but my home was now isolated on the other side of the creek. Corinne walked over to me one final time. Maybe next time you will think twice before questioning my authority, she said. Then she got in her patrol car and drove away, leaving me stranded. I spent that first night sleeping in my truck. The water was too deep and fast-moving to wade across safely, and I had no way to rebuild the bridge quickly. Everything I needed was on the other side: my tools, my materials, my entire life. But my isolation was about to get much worse. The next morning, Sheriff Corinne returned. This time she brought a folder full of official-looking documents. She waited for me on the county side of the creek, forcing me to shout across the water to communicate. I have some paperwork for you, she called out. I walked to the water's edge. What kind of paperwork? She held up a thick envelope. Tax delinquency notice. Appears you owe the county quite a bit of money. My blood ran cold. That is impossible. My property taxes are paid automatically through my bank. According to county records, you are 6 months behind on payments. Total amount due is $47,000, including penalties and interest. I felt like I was falling into a nightmare. There has to be a mistake. I have never missed a tax payment in my life. Mistake or not, you have 30 days to pay in full or face foreclosure proceedings. She tossed the envelope across the creek. Most of the papers landed in the water, but I managed to grab a few pages before they were swept away. The documents looked official, but the numbers made no sense. According to the county, my property had been reassessed at 3 times its previous value. The tax bill showed months of missed payments that I knew I had made. This is fraud, I shouted across the water. Corinne shrugged. Take it up with the tax assessor. Maybe you should have been more careful about keeping up with your obligations. As she walked back to her patrol car, she called out one more thing that made my blood freeze. Oh, and I almost forgot. Building code enforcement will be out next week to inspect your house. Seems like there might be some safety violations that need to be addressed. That was when I realized this was not about bridge safety or tax payments. This was a systematic campaign to drive me off my property. Sheriff Corinne had decided that my independence was somehow a threat to her authority, and she was using every tool at her disposal to destroy my life. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of to fight back. I called the county tax office, but they insisted their records were accurate. I contacted the building inspector, but he claimed he was just following orders. I even tried reaching out to the mayor, but his secretary told me he was unavailable. Meanwhile, I was stuck living in my truck with no access to my home or my business. I could see my house across the creek, but it might as well have been on another planet. Every morning, I woke up hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Every evening, I realized Karen was more committed to this vendetta than I had imagined. She drove by my property twice a day, always slowing down to look at me with that same satisfied smirk. Sometimes she would wave. Sometimes she would just stare. But the message was always clear. She was in control and I was powerless to stop her. That was what she thought anyway. Living in my truck turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to my investigation. With nothing else to do but wait and worry, I spent every waking hour researching Sheriff Karen's background and activities. I used the public library's internet connection to dig through county records, court filings, and local news archives. What I found made my stomach turn. Over the past 2 years, Karen had targeted at least 8 other rural property owners with similar campaigns of harassment. The pattern was always the same: sudden safety violations, inflated tax assessments, building code problems, and suspicious foreclosure proceedings. In every case, the property owners eventually gave up and sold their land at below-market prices. In every case, the properties were purchased by shell companies connected to Karen's husband, a local real estate developer named Miguel Martinez. The most disturbing case involved an elderly farmer named Henry Walsh. According to court records, Karen had declared his century-old barn an imminent safety hazard and ordered its immediate demolition. When Henry protested, she arrested him for obstruction of justice and held him in jail for 3 days. By the time Henry was released, his barn had been torn down and his property declared uninhabitable due to environmental contamination. The contamination report was signed by an inspector who had been fired from his previous job for falsifying documents. Henry lost his farm 6 months later. The property was purchased by Sunset Development LLC, one of Miguel Martinez's companies. I found similar stories involving a single mother who ran a small horse stable, a retired teacher who lived in a converted school bus, and a Vietnam veteran who had built his own off-grid cabin. All of them had been driven off their land through bogus violations and legal harassment. But the most shocking discovery came when I started looking into the tax documents Karen had given me. I managed to track down the county assessor who had supposedly signed off on my property reassessment. His name was Robert Chen, and according to his secretary, he had been on vacation in Hawaii for the past month. He had not signed any reassessment documents. He had never even heard of my property. When I showed him copies of the paperwork, his face went pale. "This is my signature," he said, "but I definitely did not sign this document. Someone forged my name." That was when I realized Karen's operation was not just harassment. It was organized crime. She was using her position as sheriff to commit fraud, forgery, and extortion on a massive scale. I started reaching out to the other victims through social media and online forums. Most of them had given up fighting and moved away, but a few were willing to share their stories. Sarah Mitchell, the single mother with the horse stable, told me that Karen had planted drugs in her barn and threatened to arrest her unless she sold her property immediately. Tom Rodriguez, the Vietnam veteran, said Karen had cut off his electricity and water by claiming his off-grid systems were illegal and dangerous to the community. Every conversation revealed new layers of corruption and abuse. Karen was not just a bad sheriff. She was running a criminal enterprise designed to steal land from people who could not defend themselves. But here is what Corinne did not know. I was not like her previous victims. I had savings, education, and most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. She had already taken my home, my bridge, and my peace of mind. Now she was about to learn what happens when you push someone too far. I knew I needed professional help, but finding the right lawyer was not easy. Most local attorneys were either afraid of Sheriff Corinne or had business relationships that created conflicts of interest. After 3 days of phone calls, I found David Chen, no relation to the county assessor, a civil rights attorney based in the state capital. David specialized in police misconduct cases and had a reputation for taking on corrupt officials. When I explained my situation, David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "Mr. Johnson, what you are describing is not just harassment. This is a federal civil rights violation under Section 1983. If we can prove Sheriff Corinne acted under color of law to deprive you of your constitutional rights, she could face serious criminal charges." David drove out to meet me that same afternoon. When he saw the destroyed bridge and heard the full extent of Corinne's campaign, his expression grew grim. "This is one of the worst cases of official corruption I have seen in 20 years of practice," he said. "But the good news is that she made mistakes, big mistakes." The first mistake was the forged tax documents. David explained that falsifying official records was a felony, and using those records to extort property was another felony. The fact that Corinne had done this while acting as a sheriff made it a federal crime. The second mistake was the bridge demolition. Private property cannot be destroyed without due process, even in emergency situations. Corinne had violated the Fourth and 14th Amendments by ordering the demolition without proper legal authority. The third mistake was the pattern of similar violations against other property owners. This showed a conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights, which carried additional federal penalties. David filed multiple lawsuits within a week. We sued Corinne personally for civil rights violations. We sued the county for allowing the corruption to continue. We sued Miguel Martinez's companies for fraud and conspiracy. But more importantly, David contacted the FBI. Special Agent Lisa Park arrived from the regional field office 3 days later. She was a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in public corruption cases. "We have been watching Sheriff Martinez for several months," she told me. "Your case provides the evidence we needed to move forward with a full investigation." It turned out the FBI had already received complaints about Corinne from other victims, but they needed more substantial proof of criminal activity. My documentation and David's legal analysis gave them what they needed. Agent Park explained that the FBI would be conducting undercover surveillance and examining all county records related to property assessments, tax collections, and building code enforcement. "This is going to take time," she warned. "Corruption cases are complex, and we need to build an airtight case. But I can tell you that Sheriff Martinez's days are numbered." While the federal investigation was proceeding, David filed emergency motions in state court to challenge the tax documents and prevent any foreclosure action against my property. The judge who heard our emergency petition was clearly disturbed by the evidence we presented. Judge Patricia Hernandez had been on the bench for 15 years and had a reputation for no-nonsense jurisprudence. "Sheriff Martinez," she said during the hearing, "can you explain to me how Mr. Johnson's property taxes increased by 300% in a single year?" Corinne's attorney fumbled through an explanation about market corrections and updated assessments. But Judge Hernandez was not buying it. And can you explain why the county assessor claims he never signed these reassessment documents? That was when Corinne's lawyer asked for a recess. When court resumed, he made a motion to dismiss all tax claims against my property, citing administrative errors in the assessment process. Judge Hernandez granted my motion for a temporary restraining order, preventing any further action against my property until the federal investigation was complete. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 months, FBI agents had gathered enough evidence to arrest Sheriff Corinne and 3 of her deputies on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning while Corinne was having coffee at the diner in town. Agent Park walked in with 2 other agents and a pair of handcuffs. "Sheriff Martinez, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." The entire diner went silent as Corinne was read her rights and led away in handcuffs. By evening, the video was all over social media and local news. The criminal trial began 6 months later. David Chen had helped the federal prosecutors prepare their case, and I was scheduled to be the lead witness. Walking into that courtroom was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. Corinne sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her badge and authority stripped away. She would not make eye contact with me. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, began by showing the jury photographs of my destroyed bridge. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this case is about abuse of power. It is about a sheriff who used her badge to terrorize innocent citizens and steal their property." My testimony took most of the morning. I described Corinne's harassment campaign in detail, from the first intimidating visit to the destruction of my bridge to the forged tax documents. When the prosecutor asked me to identify the person responsible for destroying my property, I pointed directly at Corinne. "That woman sitting right there ordered the demolition of my grandfather's bridge without legal authority, without due process, and without any legitimate safety concern." Corinne's defense attorney tried to portray her as an overzealous but well-intentioned public servant who made honest mistakes in judgment. But that argument fell apart when other victims testified. Sarah Mitchell broke down in tears while describing how Corinne threatened to have her children taken away if she did not sell her horse stable. Tom Rodriguez showed the jury photographs of Corinne's deputies cutting his power lines and water pipes. The most damaging testimony came from Robert Chen, the county assessor whose signature Corinne had forged. He brought handwriting samples and testified that someone had traced his signature onto fraudulent documents. After 3 days of testimony, the evidence was overwhelming. Corinne had systematically violated the constitutional rights of at least 12 property owners over a 2-year period. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of mail fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of extortion under color of official right, we find the defendant guilty. Corinne showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but I saw her shoulders slump with each guilty verdict. Judge Michael Torres sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all victims. She was also permanently barred from holding any law enforcement position. "Sheriff Martinez," the judge said, "you took an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this county. Instead, you terrorized them for personal gain. Your actions are a betrayal of everything law enforcement should represent. As Karen was led away to begin her prison sentence, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had been carrying for over a year. The civil lawsuit settlements came through 3 months after Karen's criminal conviction. Between the county settlement and the federal civil rights award, I received enough money to rebuild my bridge and ensure my financial security for the rest of my life. But more importantly, the other victims received justice as well. Sarah Mitchell got her horse stable back and enough money to expand her operation. Tom Rodriguez was able to rebuild his off-grid cabin with all the improvements he had always wanted. The county was forced to implement new oversight procedures for property assessments and code enforcement. A citizens' review board was established to investigate complaints against law enforcement. Miguel Martinez, Karen's husband, was convicted on conspiracy charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. All of his shell companies were dissolved, and the fraudulently acquired properties were returned to their original owners or sold, with proceeds going to victim compensation. The new bridge construction began on a crisp October morning. The county hired the best engineering firm in the state to design a structure that would last for generations. They used steel and concrete instead of wood, with safety features that exceeded all current codes. I stood on the county road and watched the construction crew work. The foreman, a friendly man named Pete, approached me during his lunch break. "This is going to be the strongest bridge in the county," he said, "built to withstand floods, storms, and anything else nature can throw at it." "What about corrupt sheriffs?" I asked. Pete laughed. "Well, I suppose we could add some extra reinforcement for that too." The bridge was completed just before Thanksgiving. As I walked across it for the first time, I thought about my grandfather and everything he had taught me about independence and standing up for what is right. The new bridge was beautiful, but it represented more than just access to my property. It symbolized the victory of ordinary citizens over institutional corruption. On Thanksgiving morning, I stood on my front porch with my coffee and watched the sun rise over the valley. The sound of water flowing beneath the bridge brought back memories of peaceful mornings before Karen's harassment began. But this peace felt different. It was not the naive tranquility of someone who had never been tested. It was the hard-earned serenity of someone who had faced injustice and refused to back down. Over the past year, I had learned that sometimes the only way to preserve your peace is to fight for it. Sometimes the only way to protect your rights is to stand up to people who want to take them away. I also learned that corruption thrives in silence and isolation. Karen was able to victimize so many people because each of us thought we were alone. Once we connected with each other and shared our stories, her power disappeared. The local newspaper wrote a series of articles about the case, and reporters from regional media outlets came to interview me. I used every opportunity to encourage other victims of official abuse to speak up and seek help. "Do not let anyone tell you that you have to accept harassment from people in positions of authority," I said in one interview. "The badge does not give anyone the right to violate your constitutional rights." My online business had suffered during the months of legal battles, but it bounced back stronger than ever. Customers who followed the story became loyal supporters, and new orders poured in from people who wanted to support someone who had stood up to corruption. As I finish writing this story, it has been 2 years since Karen's arrest. She is currently serving her sentence in federal prison and will not be eligible for parole for another 6 years. Sometimes I wonder if she has learned anything from this experience. I doubt it, People like Karen rarely change because they rarely accept responsibility for their actions. But that is not my problem anymore. I have my home, my bridge, and my peace of mind. Most importantly, I have the satisfaction of knowing that her victims received justice and that future sheriffs will think twice before abusing their authority. Every morning I walk across my grandfather's bridge, the new version, and remember that freedom is not free. It requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to fight for what is right.